Are you a good person? Not a complicated question. Are you a good person? You might be tempted to think the answer to that is yes or no. It maybe depends on who you ask. But if you think about it, it's a more complicated question than it may first appear. It's kind of a tricky question. Are you a good person? I thought I was a good person. When I was 14 years old, I thought I was a good kid. I thought I was a good person. If you had asked me, Dave, as a 14-year-old boy, are you a good person? I would have said, sure, I'm a good person. But I was a thief. See, in my early teenage years, I had picked up a hobby, and that hobby was shoplifting. And for my early teenage years, I developed quite a practice of taking things from stores that I didn't pay for. And as I look back on it, I don't ever remember really being afraid. I remember being bothered one time. I got a couple of times I got caught, kind of, but I talked my way out of it. I didn't know I didn't pay or some other lie. And I think I felt bad one time because I recruited my 6-year-old little brother to help me. He was my shill, and I remember him asking me, he said, Dave, isn't this wrong? And I said, no, I worked it out with the manager. I told another lie. And as I look back on it, I never felt guilty about it. I never really felt any shame about it. See, it was easy for me to rationalize it, for me to justify it. You see, I was taking things that I needed, things that I couldn't afford. And so I knew I wouldn't be able to get them unless I took them. It wasn't like I was stealing to sell things, to buy drugs or anything like that. I was a good person. As I look back on it, I realize how easy it is for us to rationalize and to justify our personal morality. Last week we began a study, it's more of a search actually, a search for our souls. I proposed that we consider ourselves not as simply a bag of chemicals that is here today and gone tomorrow, that human beings are not just natural, biological, physical beings. There is more to us than meets the eye, that we are both material and immaterial beings. And even modern anthropologists and modern medicine and modern psychology affirm that we are more than meets the eye, that we are not just our bodies, we are also our minds and our thoughts and our consciousness, and we are also our emotions, and we are a body and mind and feelings. And this is totally consistent with the image that the Bible gives us of our human existence. That as human beings, we are made in God's image, and we are triune as God is triune, and we have a body, and we have a spirit, and we have a soul. And so the instrument that we are using to examine our souls is the instrument of the Bible. And I suggested last week, as we were examining the evidence for the existence of our soul, that the first evidence that the Bible gives us is this idea that we have an awareness of, an appreciation of, even a capacity to create beauty. That we are not like other creatures. We have a capacity to see esoterically, abstractly, the beauty in things, and we can even create it ourselves. And that is evidence of our soul. And so today I want to suggest a second evidence that we discover as we look for our souls through the lens of the Bible, and that is that we have morality. That we are necessarily moral beings. We need to have direction and purpose and meaning in our life. And that morality is part of what it means to be human. Now, you could argue, well, Dave, I have met some people who appear to be immoral, if not amoral, people who live without a conscience. But I would suggest, in a circular logic kind of way, in a way that would reference Descartes in the early 1600s, who basically argued, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, I would argue that the absence of morality is itself a morality. That to not have morals is in and of itself an operating system by which people live. And that immaterial operating system is evidence of our souls. So today I want to step into the laboratory and look through the lens of the 19th Psalm. And I want to point out that in the 19th Psalm, we discover something about our souls. It's in verse 7. In Psalm 19:7, as we look through the lens of the instrument of the Bible for our souls, the author, David, says that the law of God, the Torah of God, is perfect, and it refreshes our souls. What does that mean, and why does that matter? I want us to press into that. I want to pick that apart today and examine it in depth. But before we put on our lab coats and sit down to examine these things, I'd like to pray. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight. That you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us, not just to be right, but to be good. Pray that for myself, for my family, for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. The first weekend in May 1970, in a small town 40 miles south of Cleveland, Ohio, thousands of young people, mostly college students, had gathered together to protest the war in Vietnam. On Friday and Saturday, the protest had escalated into riots in the small city of Kent, Ohio. Windows were broken, storefronts were vandalized, and in fact, on Saturday, the ROTC office, the Reserve Officer Training Corps office in Kent, Ohio, was set on fire. In response to this, the governor of the state of Ohio called up the Ohio National Guard and sent them to Kent. Plans were being made to extend the protest through the weekend from Sunday into Monday, but the government printed up 12,000 flyers and distributed them throughout the town, telling people that the Monday protest had been canceled. So on Monday, May 4th of 1970, on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio, 77 Ohio National Guardsmen were confronted by a group of about 300 college students. For most of the morning, it was a standoff, the college students yelling epithets and throwing rocks and bottles at the guards. And the guardsmen maintained their composure, even though they were armed with their M1 rifles. They stood off at a distance from one another. But suddenly at 12:24 in the afternoon, shots rang out. In the subsequent investigation, it was determined that 61 rounds had been fired by 28 of the guardsmen. The volley of shots lasted 13 seconds, and at the end of 13 seconds, 9 college students lay wounded, and 4 were killed. 4 college students killed by fellow Americans, their peers in uniform. Now, we have a tendency to think, given the divisiveness of the social conversations, of the cultural conflicts and the political arguments of our day, that we are living in the most divisive time in American history, and that's far from true. It seems that every generation needs to stretch its legs and find its voice and push against the establishment. But it's the passion of it. It's the volatility of it. It's the incendiary nature of it that interests me. You see, because what it reflects and what I see in the argumentative and divisive nature of our cultural conversation is a battle for the soul of a generation, the battle for the soul of a nation. Because our souls are fashioned to have purpose and meaning. And when we are in pursuit of purpose and meaning, when we have a morality, when we sign a morality to our points of view, they are no longer debates about good and bad or right and wrong. They become debates about good and evil. And in the context of the moralization of our points of view, we find that our passions are inflamed and the arguments are no longer arguments about this would be a good idea or that would be a bad idea. They are religious arguments. They're not just political or sociological debates, they are spiritual and theological debates. And if I'm familiar with anything, I'm familiar with religious debates when I hear them. And what I hear all across our culture are people not arguing about their points of view and not arguing about facts, but arguing about what they believe. And once we start to talk about what we believe, we are entering into the realm of our soul. And when we explore the nature of our soul, we find out the intensity that is associated with it. As we search for our soul through the lens of the 19th Psalm, we come down to verse 7. And in verses 7, 8, and 9 of Psalm 19, David builds on this idea that he captures in verse 7, that the Torah of God is perfect. And that the law, that the morality of God has the ability to renew, to resurrect, to refresh our souls, to liberate our souls. And David is so passionate about this idea that he creates 3 couplets of pairs of phrases. And he repeats himself 6 times, over and over and over. He creates a veritable word salad. And he opens his thesaurus and he says over and over and over again how passionate he is about the law of God. In verse 7, he literally says, the law of God is perfect, it is without flaw, and it refreshes the nephesh, the soul. He says then that the statutes of God are amar. Amar is the Hebrew word for a pillar in a building. They're solid, they are stable. And because the statutes of God are reliable and trustworthy, they make wise. The Hebrew word is hakam. It means wisdom, and this word means to make wise. And in the NIV, it's translated the simple, but I don't like that. Because it's not simple-minded. It's people who don't overcomplicate things. It literally has the idea of the law of God has the ability to refresh the soul of a person who is open-minded, who is teachable. He goes on to say that the precepts of God are right. The precepts of God are so life-giving that they are able to give joy to our heart, to the love. And then he says that the commands of God are barach. They are reflective, they are shiny, they are illuminating, and they bring light to the eyes. He then says the fear of God. The fear of God is pure. It is reliable. It is without flaw. And it is everlasting. It doesn't change. The awesomeness of God is without end. And at the end of verse 9, he says the ordinances or the directives of God are emet, are true. They're they're reliable, they're righteous, and they're righteous sodic in everything. And what David is doing is expressing his passion. He's tapping into that thing in our souls that says, when I find my purpose, when I find my meaning, I find that thing that I cannot not do. This is life-giving for me. And he overflows with repetition. It's like if you go to a restaurant and they make a fine meal and you say, that was delicious, that was spectacular, that was amazing, that was tasty, that was overwhelming, and you can't find enough adjectives. When your wife comes downstairs dressed to the nines for an evening out and you say, you look beautiful, you look gorgeous, you look spectacular, you look marvelous, you look hot. And you can't find the words. This is what David is doing. He's dumping the thesaurus out to say, I found my meaning in life. I found my purpose. I found my direction. And in finding that, I found life itself. Verse 10, he puts an exclamation point on it, where he says that the law of God, the Torah of God, the morality of God, the meaning that I find in my faith and in my soul is more precious than gold. It's more precious than refined gold that has been made into fantastic jewelry. It's sweeter than honey, and not just any honey, but honey straight from the hive, straight from the honeycomb. You see, this is the cry of our souls. The cry of our souls is for meaning and for purpose and for direction. It's for boundaries, for rules, for guidance. And when we find that, we find life itself. David goes on to say there, and the thing that he does that's interesting is he repeats one word 6 times. He repeats this word, Yahweh. It is the name for God, the sacred name, the personal name. The name that God gave Moses in the burning bush. It literally means I am. And it is inserted 6 times. In these verses, it's the only word that is repeated over and over. The law of God, the precepts of God, the statutes of God, the commands of God, the fear of God, the ordinances of God, of the Lord, of Yahweh, over and over and over, because this is the source. His purpose and his meaning is not internal, it's not situation ethics, it's not handmade. It is transcendent, it is eternal, and David has dialed his soul into it. And he goes on to say that this orientation, this alignment guides his life. Any of you know how to use a compass? Does anybody use a compass anymore? You can use a compass on a map. You could, like, if I gave a map and you could say, find your way, you could walk through the woods, find your way. Why would you do that? Do you not have a phone? Do you not have Google Maps? Google Maps is amazing. I mean, when we were traveling in Europe last month, it didn't matter where we were. If we were in Barcelona, we're like, where is the Sagrada de Familia? And I would just type it into Google Maps, and it would say, walk this way. When we were in Rome, how do I get to Trieste Fountain? Just walk this way. We're in Menaggio, Italy, and we were looking for this little, well-reviewed little restaurant way up on a hill, and it took us on this hike. We were in a little town in France, Saint-Emilion, France. And we went to Saint-Emilion, it's in Bordeaux, because Riverbender, Bill, said, you need to go to Saint-Emilion. It's my favorite village in France. And we went there, and he's right. If you've ever seen Saint-Emilion, it's like a postcard. It's like a movie set. And I took a picture of the town square in Saint-Emilion, and I texted it to Bill. And a few minutes later, he texted me back. He said, I know exactly where you are. You need to go to this wine merchant, ETS Martin, and Saint-Emilion's not that big of a village, but there's dozens of wine merchants in Saint-Emilion. But I typed in ETS Martin, and Google said, it's right there. It was like 100 feet away. Now, we could have walked around San Emilion the whole day. We could have been searching, we could have been wandering, and I can think of a lot worse things to do than walk around San Emilion on a beautiful 65-degree day, sampling wine in dozens of these wine merchants' stores. But when we walked into this wine merchant, I said, Bill sent me. You would have thought the Pope had sent me. They said, Bill, oh, Bill from America, we love Bill. I got a 2-hour tutorial from Ben, the manager, on Bordeaux wines. It was spectacular. Now, if I just wanted to wander around, I didn't need direction. I didn't need orientation. I didn't need guidance. But if I wanted to get where I was going, if I wanted to be where I needed to be, then I needed that direction. And that's what the Torah is for David. It was his GPS. In verse 11, he says, by the Torah, by the law, by the commands of God, my soul is warned. It's the word zahar, and it means illuminated. I discover things I wouldn't have otherwise discovered. And he says, in keeping the Torah of God, there's great reward. And the word for reward is akab, and it literally means footprints. And it's almost as if we follow a path that has been set out for us. It's the cry of our souls to have a meaning and to have a purpose in life. And that code, that moral code, is the language of our soul. It is the evidence that our souls exist. It is how we care for our souls, by searching it out. It's what I've spent 50 years of my life doing, asking the question, what would you have me to do? Who would you have me to be? How would you have me to live? I have fashioned my entire life on that pursuit, on that purpose, on that mission, orienting myself to that morality. This is evidence that we are more than just physical beings, a bag of chemicals or bones, or we are just more than our physical bodies. We have a soul, and we know this because we orient ourselves toward beauty, and we need a necessary morality. Next week, we'll talk about the third line of evidence that brings all of these things together, but we need to take a moment to talk about how this works in real time. Anybody watch the news the last 72 hours? Anybody have an opinion about what's going on in the news over the last few days? I know you do. You may not realize it, but you are sitting in a room with people who disagree with you. You are sitting in rows and in sections of this auditorium with people who violently, rigorously see things exactly the opposite from you. I promise you, if I were to tell you what my personal political or ideological convictions are, that half of you would disagree with me. And that's a good thing. You see, I think we're all aware of the intensity of the division and the incendiary nature of our political and our cultural debates, that it is dividing us. And really what I see when I see the emotion and the intensity that is attached to our cultural conversations, I see our souls laid bare. I see our souls in turmoil, because what is going on, what is at stake, are the souls of our neighbors in our community and the soul of our nation. And so the intensity of the disagreement doesn't surprise me. And as I look around the landscape of our church and other churches, I realize that conventional wisdom would say, pick a side, choose a team, take a stand. And there are many churches in this city and many churches in this country led by men and women that I know and I respect. And they feel called to be representing one side of the argument or the other. And they say, this is what we believe. This is our conviction. This is what we represent. And they draw together people who agree with them. Because who doesn't want that? We all want to be right. We all want people around us to go, you know what? You're right. They're wrong. You're right. You're good. They're bad. Who of us doesn't want to gather together with like-minded people, birds of a feather? And I understand that. And I'm thankful that there are refuges where people can be together and they don't have to be so combative. And the conventional wisdom would say that it takes courage to take a stand, to pick a side. But I would say it takes even more courage to be a peacemaker, to be a bridge builder. It takes more courage to build than to tear down, to be a peacemaker than to be a troublemaker. And that is our mission. Our mission is not to divide. Our mission is to bring people together. Our mission is to find the good. We know how we are different. We know what our opinions are. But our mission is not to be right as much as it is to be good. You see, I think the true north that David was pointing to, the orientation that he had, the Torah of God, when he says that the law of God is perfect and it refreshes the soul, he's talking about the same thing that I am. You see, there was a young rabbi, a Galilean rabbi. His name was Joshua ben Joseph. You know him as Jesus of Nazareth. And he was confronted by religious leaders and they asked him, okay, if the Torah, if the law of God is an essential part of our human existence, if we have to have this morality, what is the essence of it? What is the greatest commandment, he's asked in Matthew chapter 22. And Jesus quotes from the Torah. He quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. He says, the greatest of all commandments is love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Love in a vertical way. Be focused on being good. And then he said, but there's a second dimension to it, a horizontal dimension. And he quotes again from the Torah in Leviticus chapter 19. And he says there's a second command that is equal to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And that is to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is orienting our souls to the morality of God. And he is reminding us that it's not necessary. We don't have to be right, but we have to be good. It'd be nice to be both, but when you can't, it's better to be good than right. On May the 4th, 1970, on the campus of Kent State University, at 12:24 in the afternoon, when 28 of the National Guardsmen opened fire on their peers and killed 4 of their own generation, fellow Americans. There was a photographer, a young photojournalism student named John Philo, who was nearing the end of his roll of film and shot his last frames and captured an image that was soon published around the nation. It's an image of a young woman named Marianne Vecchio on her knees with her arms outstretched, with pain etched on her face, kneeling over the dead body of a young Kent State student named Jeffrey Miller. On that day at Kent State, Everyone there was concerned about being right. What they needed was someone to be concerned about being good. If not there, where? If not then, when? When my oldest daughter, Kaya, was 17 years old, she was caught shoplifting. The irony of that does not escape me. It was on a Sunday, and that particular Sunday I was at church and I was doing some baptisms that evening, and my family was at home, and I didn't hear anything about the incident, Kaya's arrest, and she was with her youngest sister, Caitlin, and their mother came and got them and brought them home. And so as I walked in Sunday evening, my 3 daughters were sitting on the sofa in the living room, and I could tell that they had been crying. And what was etched on my wife's face in stone was, "Wait till your father gets home." And so I walked in the room, and I knew that something had gone terribly wrong. And my wife told the story, and Kaya told her version of the story of how a store detective had caught her trying to leave the store with some merchandise she hadn't paid for, and that they were going to cause her to do some things, and they explained the whole story. And as I sat there, I didn't know the right thing to say, because I knew it would be wrong for me to say, "They're just a chip off the old block, you know." Like father, like daughter, how about that? You know what they say about apples and trees. I knew that wasn't the right thing to say. So I told her to get in the car with me. And we drove across town. And really, I was just buying time because I didn't know what the right thing to do was. We drove to a Lexus dealership, and for 6 months before that, I had been talking to my family, like, if I could buy any car in the world, I'd buy a Lexus. But we didn't have the money for it. It was out of our price range, and I drove to the car lot, and it was closed on Sunday evening. We just walked around, and I was just trying to think of what to say. So finally, we got back in the car. I said, "Sweetheart, there's 2 things you need to know. One is there will always be things in your life that you want that you can't have. And that's not a bad thing. That's okay." And the only other thing I could think to say to her was, "You know, I will always love you." I didn't know the right thing to say, so I chose to say the good thing. Sometimes when we don't know what's right, we need to do what's good. If not us, who? If not here, where? So I leave you with the question we began with. Are you a good person?